Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our last in our series of my HCP standards. Really enjoyed meeting you over the last sort of 6 months, well, 5 or 6 months. We started these, believe it or not, in September last year, and this is the last one. And ironically, it's about keeping records of your work, which actually probably underpins, this standard probably underpins everything else we've actually talked about. So it's sort of perfect to look at that today. So just a quick review of what we are going to cover. We're going to look very briefly at the My HCP standards and role. We will then look at standard 10, which is about record keeping. Just a few reminders of a bit of housekeeping. The session will finish at about 10 to 3. The slides will be available after the event and you will be sent them. And also the recording will also be available after the event on YouTube, and you'll be sent the link to that. So the usual sort of things, we'll be using polling during the session and sort of usual things that we look at, which is case studies, which is quite a nice way of doing it. So hello, my name's Kim. I've met you before. I'm a professional liaison consultant at the HCPC. And just a quick reminder, if you haven't already looked at Dr. Kate Granger and her fantastic legacy of Hello, my name is, then please do, because that's a really good thing to have a look at. So just my usual GDPR slide, and actually ironically we are going to look at data protection a little bit during our session as well when we look at record keeping, but just a reminder that your name will come up at the side of the screen. We are recording this session, so the usual GDPR things, but we only use your name and we only use your contact details for to send out the links to this presentation, but also we are going to send out a link to a evaluation, and we might be using some of your quotes in some future marketing. So the usual GDPR sort of cautions and thoughts really. So we're going to start with the usual Slido, and I make no apology for this because this is a really helpful tool for us to work out what's best for you as participants of this webinar. And I'm going to ask you quickly if you could let me know what professional group you belong to. And we've been meeting a lot more of the professional bodies recently, and they've been really helpful in publicising some of the, oh, sorry, apologies, I don't think I turned that on, so my deep apologies. Whoops, let's turn that back on again. There we go, sorry. Off and on. I can see that you voted. One person voted, that's always a good sign. But again, we have been using this information to target some marketing for these events, and actually to also produce some material for students that might be useful for after some of these events as well. So lots of useful stuff that we produce. And as I said to you before, that sometimes when it goes up into the ether to Slido, wherever that is, and it comes back down again and bounces onto my screen, I can see actually a lot more people have participated in this response than other people, so that's really helpful. And it says my phone is trying to disconnect, which is not very helpful, is it really? But I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine. I'm going to ask no, that's absolutely fine. Brilliant. So I'm going to ask Kelly if she's on the call. If we do have a problem with this, Kelly, oh no, it's come back on again. I was going to ask you to take over the Slido. It's absolutely fine. So thank you very much for that. Perfect. Really super useful information. And my usual question, when you think of the HCPC, what word comes to mind? So we've experienced lots of different words during the sessions we've done, and actually, again, they're really useful for us because we can feed these back. Expensive, thank you. You do have to pay your regulation fees. I'm a nurse by profession, as you know, and I have to pay my fees to the Nursing Midwifery Council, as lots of people do to regulators, lawyers, solicitors, etc. But you know, it is always, when you pay it, you always think, oh goodness me, I've got that to pay. It's another expense, but you know, you can claim it against tax, and I would remind you to do that. If you do a self-assessment, or even if you don't, do go onto the HMRC website and you can claim that back against your tax bill. But thank you very much for that. That's super useful. Thank you for your thoughts. So I'm going to ask you my last question, which is how you would rate your current understanding of Standard 10, which is what we're going to look at today, 0 to 10. Just a quick flick of the screen, if you don't mind, just to know where you are with your understanding of Standard 10 and record keeping. And remember that we've got the chat box here as well, and my colleagues, I'm going to introduce you to them in a minute, but they're waiting for your questions about record keeping. So we're very happy to take any questions that you've got about record keeping and what your concerns are. Particularly, we hope that we've picked up some of the concerns that we've picked up during looking at your inquiries that come into standards. But if there's any more, then this is your opportunity to speak to the regulator, really. But thank you very much for that. That's super helpful. So my first slide really is always a little bit about the HCP role and standards. Just a reminder that our standards are there to support you as registrants. As you know, we are at the moment updating our standards of proficiency. They're actually sort of in play at the moment. They're actually being done with the consultations closed for those, so they are being updated by our standards colleagues, but that will be really helpful. So thinking of our standards colleague, I'm just going to ask, if you don't mind, Grace, would you mind introducing yourself? I know you're going to talk later, but would you just mind saying what you do?
Yeah, hi, my name is Grace Costain. I am a Senior Policy Officer in the Policy and Standards team at HCPC.
Thank you, Grace. I know you're going to be helping with the case studies in a minute. And we've got Kelly here, Kelly Green.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Green and I'm the Head of Professionalism and Upstream Regulation at the HCPC, and I'm here waiting for everyone's questions and can help answering those. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Kelly. And you will have had lots of emails from the lovely Holly to enable you to join this webinar. So Holly, I know you're there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. My name's Holly. I'm the Events and Communications Officer at the HCPC.
Lovely. Thanks, Holly. And Holly coordinates all your invites and coordinates all the survey at the end. So thanks ever so much, Holly. So this is one we're going to be looking at today, and we've covered, believe it or not, the rest of them during the webinars, but just wanted to remind everybody really that our standards aren't prescriptive. They can't cover every single ethical scenario that you're faced with as a registrant. They're a sort of high level framework really, and they give you the autonomy and flexibility to practice in a way that you need to, in the context that you actually need to. But one thing we are going to talk a little bit about later on during the session is professional judgment. So you always, as a registrant, have to use your professional judgment, and that's what our standards help you actually do. So that's what they're there for. So we're going to look at standard 10, record keeping, as I said. And standard 10 has actually got two parts. First part was about keeping accurate records, and the second part is about keeping records secure. So we've divided this webinar into two sort of main bits really. We get a lot of questions about this area, so it's really super important area for you as registrants. So the first part is about keeping accurate records. And we're very clear there that we want you to keep full, clear and accurate records. And these must be, can never say this word, contemporaneous. So they must be written as near to the time that you actually care for the patient as possible. And one really important thing I wanted to point out to you is if you have to add to your record, make sure that you don't actually change it, you don't cross things out, that actually your record remains as it is. And if you need to change something or update something, you actually write a new piece in the record, and you actually write a new piece with a new date and actually write something. It's really important, and that's also, it's very important for our professionalism that we don't actually alter things in clinical records. So record keeping. It has several functions. The first one is to share information with colleagues, really important. And that's why it's really nice if they're written contemporaneously, because that gives the other colleague who's maybe caring for that patient an instant record of what actually has happened with that person. They ensure that service users get appropriate treatment that's in their best interests. And I think what's often forgotten is that they actually a legal requirement. I think that the most important thing is also courts of law, but also freedom of information requests, subject access requests. So our legal records, our records can actually be used for any of those things. And there is evidence of decision making if you are later queried or investigated. So that's really important. So let's have a look at what we've said recently about record keeping under pressure, because we've all been dealing with the pandemic for the last 13 or 14 months now. And the HCPC has written some information for you as registrants on some specific issues, because we know that you had concerns during the pandemic. The first thing is keeping records. Now, Grace is going to look in a minute about the way that we keep records, but it depends on your professionalism. It depends on your profession, should I say, and sometimes that might need to be adapted during COVID. It talks about completing records promptly to ensure continuity of care and justifying decision making, as we've already said, but also keeping records securely, and we're going to talk about that later in a case study. And remember that there are people like the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, who also released a statement during COVID saying that they'll take a reasonable and pragmatic approach to record keeping. So I thought that was quite useful, actually. So our first scenario is Samantha. And we've met Samantha before a couple of times. We've met Samantha when she was worried about her scope of practice. And we've also met her when she was worried about making a mistake. She'd just been redeployed to critical care. Now, this inquiry came in about a month and a half ago when she was also back redeployed into critical care, and she was actually worried because the ITU managers had reduced the amount of information in the records that they needed to capture each day on ITU, and she was worried about that really. And I can understand her concerns because, you know, it's concerning if things have changed, and she's wondering why they've changed. So what we'd ask Samantha to do was to think about what I've already said. Our standards are flexible, and we actually don't prescribe the way that our record keeping occurs. The HCPC doesn't actually say how you've got to do your records really. And also just to say that the great thing about starting in a new area or in any place when you're seconded to a new place is that you are fresh eyes and ears. So you look at things differently, and actually that's a really healthy thing to do. And managers will appreciate that. And obviously the ITU managers have thought very carefully about balancing the extra workload of staff with the need to maintain patient safety, and they've made a decision that actually they need to reduce the amount of information that's captured each day. So it will be really important for Samantha to be talking to managers and just say, you know, you've got to pick your time. Obviously, you've got to pick a time when it's less busy, but to actually say to the managers, I'm a bit worried, and I'm a bit worried that we're not recording all this information. And some of the bits in the record keeping, I'm a bit worried that actually we need to record. So fresh eyes and ears, really useful to clarify with those managers why they've made those decisions. But if Samantha's still worried and she hasn't received the, you know, the response that she feels, then also she needs to think about escalating that concern, doesn't she? And we looked at raising concerns, I know, in one of our previous in Standard 7, because that's actually the one it's related to. And I'd always recommend that you never go home worried. As a registrant, try never to go home worried, because there's nothing worse than going home and worrying about something. So if Samantha's going to go home and worry that she hasn't done what she feels is appropriate record keeping, then, you know, that's something she needs to A, talk to the managers about, and B, escalate if she's worried. Samantha's actually back in the theatre department, so she's back in her normal environment now, so we probably won't be hearing from Samantha for a while. But just to remind everybody of our raising concerns guidance, and I'd wanted to take this moment just to point out to you that we've been redesigning our website, our standards part of our website, since lockdown, and actually what we've done is we've put it under themes. So you can see this theme is called Raising Concerns, Openness and Honesty. Those things really gel together, don't they, really? And the other themes are actually things like confidentiality, social media, communication. So all of our guidance is put under different themes so that you as registrants will make it'll be much more easier for you to navigate. So that's a screenshot of our latest bit of our website, really. So I'm going to move on now to my colleague, lovely colleague Grace, who's going to look at Mr. Anand. Grace, would that be all right if you're going to look at Mr. Anand? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to just look at Mr. Anand, and I'm going to pop a picture of Grace, if that's all right, Grace, up onto the screen. Here we go. So Grace, anything you've got to say about Mr. Anand and Addy, who's the newly qualified speech and language therapist? There we go. You're up on the screen now, Grace.
Thanks, Kim. Firstly, I just want to apologise. My internet keeps that doesn't impact on me now. But yeah, so in terms of this situation, so I just want to say it's really common for professionals to be involved in the treatment of another person, and sharing information is good practice. Patients will often understand that it's for their best interest. In this case, the patient has specifically asked whether the information will be shared. So there's an implied consent that they can share this information onto another professional. But you'll usually have implied, which is normally identified when they ask for further services or when you discuss this with them. So even in instances where you don't have explicit consent, it's really important to follow best practice when you share information. So you should try to ensure that all the information you share, well, it must always be done so in the best interest of the patient. You should try to obtain consent where possible and where appropriate. You should only share information that is necessary and relevant. So try to keep it to the minimum necessary, really. Do so in a way that's safe and secure so that it doesn't if possible, you should also try to have a conversation with the service user and explain what information, what the purpose of that is for. You could also, in certain circumstances, if they allow, you could also provide the service user with a copy of the information you're sharing. So it's for their records, and again, just so that they have a good understanding of what you're going to be sharing with the.
Thanks, Grace. That's lovely.
I think it's also important to do the duty to keep it confidential.
Bless you, Grace. I think your poor internet is struggling today, isn't it? That's horrible. It's horrible when it does that, isn't it? And I was going to ask you a question, Grace. Should I think I'm right in saying that it would be routine for you to keep a copy of that patient's records that you sent to the neurologist and GP in the patient's notes, wouldn't it be?
Yes. Yes, it would be. Sorry, I'm not sure we're in a delay in time, so I'm hoping we're not, and I'm not speaking to you, but yes, it would be routine.
You're doing great, Grace. Thanks very much. Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much, Grace, for that. So I think the key points are that there would need to be consent, obviously, and Mr. Anand has kindly asked you to send him the report to the neurologist and GP, so that's fantastic. It's confidential, only disclose information that if it's relevant, and think about sharing with Mr. Anand what you're going to do, giving him a copy, keeping that on record, and also thinking about if you're worried about these sorts of things and thinking about a data protection course that usually lots and lots of employers run. So that's really, really helpful. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Grace. That's fantastic. So we're going to go on to the next slide now, which is actually any questions. And we may not have any questions at the moment, Kelly, but are there any questions in the chat box?
Oh, hi, Kim. Thank you. We haven't got any questions at this stage. We've been posting the links in there. What we do have is some people on slide and that explaining that they're having some difficulties also accessing the event. Please bear with us. Holly and I are trying to resolve that in the background. So please do bear with us and we'll try and get some more links sent out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. It's the technology we're all getting used to it, aren't we? And we're all getting a bit fed up with it at times, but we just have to work around it, don't we, and carry on. So I'm going to use this opportunity also just to ask you, as registrants dialed in today, are there any other topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars? If you could write those in the chat box. We have done a couple of other things recently on remote consultations. I went to a webinar myself yesterday evening on CPD, but if there's anything else that you want us to cover, please pop it in the chat box and we will definitely try and do that for you. So I'll return to that later if that's all right. So brilliant. So we've looked at the importance of record keeping. And what I want to do now really is look at keeping records securely. So this is really important because it's about protecting them from loss, damage or inappropriate access. So those three things are really, really important. Now we get a lot of queries about this and I've read the inquiries that Grace and my colleague Matt, who's not on the call today but normally is, get about these, and so there's a lot of information, but it sort of links back to the principles of our standards in the fact that we don't have any specific information on how long, where you should keep them, because it actually depends on many things, and we're going to look at those many things as we go through some scenarios, if that's okay. I'm going to see how Grace is with the next scenario, but I can definitely do it if Grace doesn't. So Grace, this is our next scenario, and this is Ravinda, who is an art therapist, and Ravinda conducts therapy sessions with individual clients from home. We've actually met Ravinda before because we've met Ravinda when we were looking at confidentiality, and she was worried about using video platforms and speakers on her computer, actually when we were very new to doing things virtually. And Ravinda's quite concerned about what system she should use to keep her clinical records safe. So I'm going to see if Grace is able to answer this. And if not, Grace, I will definitely do it myself. So let's see if you can come online, Grace, just for a second. We'll just pause for a second. See if she's going to come. Here we are,
Hi,
Grace.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Just take over if my internet fails.
I will, don't worry.
So
Grace, I think I'm going to take over. Would you mind? Is that all right? I'm going to take over from you because I feel so desperately sad for you not being able to. I know exactly what it's like, so please don't worry. Grace and I have spent a lot of time preparing the answers to these questions, so we both know what each other's going to say. So what I know that Grace would say is that it depends on your practice and your profession. Now, Ravinder's an art therapist, so we don't know if Ravinder keeps her records electronically or by paper, and it actually doesn't matter either way because the principles are still the same. One of the most important things, obviously, is to protect the patient's confidentiality, the service user's confidentiality. So, you know, password protections for computers, even though they're in our own home, it's still important to have your work computer password protected, or in something like a locked filing cabinet or a locked drawer in your house would be really useful as well. But you've got to be confident that that sort of where you keep your records meets legal requirements, really, all right, for it to be enabled to be confidential. All right, so it totally depends on your work, where you work and your profession. And if you're worried, it might also be worth speaking to your employer and your professional body. They've got lots and lots of experience in this, or a lawyer indeed who's got some concerns. I know, and I mentioned earlier, that there are lots of e-learning materials, things like data protection, that you can do to actually get you thinking about how important it is to keep where the systems are, that you keep those clinical records secure. So if you've got any particular profession-specific questions or questions that you want to put on chat, we're also very happy to answer those. So the next part of Ravinder is that she's not only concerned about the systems and where she should keep them and how she should keep them, but one of the big concerns we actually have is how long she's got to retain her records for after her therapy is completed, because Ravinder might just be doing art therapy for a short period of time, and she might wonder how long she's got to keep those records for after she finishes her client interaction. So again, thinking about our guidance again, no specific guidance from us. We don't say how long, we don't say how many years or how many months, but there are other fantastic experts who do. And so we get this question quite a lot. It's about using the three things we talked about quite a lot. It's thinking about your professional judgment, thinking about the law, and thinking about best practice for your profession to enable you to come to a decision, really. And I'm going to signpost you to some really key bits of legislation, really, that I think are really important. The first one, they're divided between England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and there are specific organisations that deal with how long you've got to have records kept for each of those areas. There is the Records Management Code of Practice for Health and Social Care in England and Wales, and interestingly, that's just had finished a consultation. The new guidance for that is actually due to come out fairly soon, and we will update that as soon as it comes out on our website, because that's really important. That's very specific, and it's got an appendix 3, which is a spreadsheet which clearly sets out under several headings, and you'll be able to work out which of your clients fall into which group. It sets out how long you need to keep those records for. For example, adult healthcare records are kept until 8 years after discharge or death, and there are very specific guidance for things like cancer patients, long-term illness, patients seeking contraceptive advice. So there's so many variables in this that it's quite difficult to tie it down for you. There's the Scottish Government's Records Management for Health and Social Care Code of Practice. That came out much more recently in 2020, so it's much more recent for Scotland. But for example, children's records, now they're a little bit more complicated. And if Ravinder was doing art therapy with children, she'd need to keep those records until the child's 25th or 26th birthday. If the young person was 17 at the conclusion of treatment, or indeed if unfortunately they died 3 years after the patient's death. So again, you can see how specific it is, and you've really got to look at those bits of guidance to actually get to find out exactly what each part says, and depending where you live. So finally, the Department of Health's Good Management, Good Records Guidance. I love the title of that, Good Management, Good Records. This is in Northern Ireland. This was also updated in January 21. So again, a lot more recent updated piece of guidance. And it talks about the it calls them disposal schedules. And that defines the minimum length of time that specific records need to be changed by. And again, very similar, and I had to write these down for myself. Adults 8 years after conclusion of treatment or death, and the child records is very similar to what we've talked about before, but things like clinical psychology 20 years and orthodontic 6 years. So you know, it's very different depending what profession you're in and where you live and where you practice. So do have a look at that if that's okay. The other thing, Let me move on for a second. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that sometimes as healthcare professionals, you need to keep a patient's records for your CPD. Now, obviously, any CPD entries or any CPD information that you collect, any clinical supervision that you do for your CPD, you will obviously use anonymized case information. So you won't have the patient's name, date of birth, etc. in your records. And actually this is covered in the virtual CPD workshops that we actually ran one yesterday that I went to, but we're also covering one on the 24th of June. And if you want to go to that, we'll post the link on our chat box, because that's really useful. But just remember that when you keep things like that for CPD, that they do need to be anonymised, and if you did have clinical supervision that you wanted to sort of reference, then it does need to be anonymised. All right, I just wanted to point that out to you. So that was our last thing about record keeping. But our last thing about keeping when you dispose of records. But what I also thought we'd look at is another issue about record keeping and concerns from registrants. This is one we have an awful lot as well. This is Jim, who's an occupational therapist. We also looked at Jim when we looked at confidentiality, but I thought he'd be really useful for looking at sharing records. So Jim's just received a request for a court-ordered disclosure about a patient who he looked after about a year ago now. All right, he's an occupational therapist, and he's worried because this isn't the sort of thing that you have often. It might only occur once or twice in your career as a registrant. So he's obviously quite worried about what he's going to do. So let's think about what he might have to do, because this is really, really important, really. He would need to think, check the wording of the court-ordered disclosure and certainly get some legal advice. Often many of the colleges have some fantastic legal support that they can provide you to actually send the court order to a lawyer and get them to look at it. Be thinking about really, as long as checking the wording, thinking about only disclosing information about the person or the organisation who's named in the order. So very clearly, you're only going to stick to what they've actually named in the order. All right, and only disclose what you've been asked to. You don't need to add extra information. So just literally disclose what you've been asked for. And do remember that if you get a court-ordered disclosure, it is important to reply by the date that they actually ask. So it's not the sort of thing just to leave on your pile of papers and just let it go. It needs to be really dealt with. And also it's the sort of thing that could take you some time to reply to, because you'd need to get some legal advice. You'd probably need to send it to the college, legal, whoever you're covered with. And you might need to run it by your manager as well. So there's many people that you need to discuss this with. So that's all going to take quite a lot of time. And remember, there are other professionals there as your professional bodies, but there's also the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, who I talked about earlier, solicitors, your employer, and other people that you trust and value. So certainly this is a really, really important thing that you've been asked to do, and you need to think about that and need to treat it very, very seriously and very carefully. And just a quick I'm going to flash up that picture of our guidance there, thinking about, we do have guidance called Confidentiality that scenario came from. So actually that's really, really useful guidance as well, just to be thinking about and just to underpin everything you do. And I also want to signpost you to a professional body. This is the College of Optometrists. Now, I did a big search around all the colleges and looked at what they had on record keeping. And lots of them had some really good information. And this college particularly, you can see those headings there are super. Things like specific to that profession, things like imaging, things like ownership of records, things like, what to do if you're thinking about selling a patient's records, goodness knows. So some really good information on the Royal Colleges, and there's a couple of other colleges that I've written down that I also thought might be useful to you as well. So I'm going to just signpost those quickly because I think they've got some really good stuff. The CSP for physiotherapists, again, it's got some really important information about how long a physiotherapist should keep records for, and indeed quite a good query from a physiotherapist who is employed by another person who's a self-employed physiotherapist and not sure what to do. All those sort of little nuances that are specific to your profession would be really important. But I think one of the things that we really need to think about when we are sharing records is making sure that the person that you're sharing records of knows what you're doing and is aware of what information you're going to share, and they have a right to prevent you from sharing information. So that's really important. Lots of good stuff on the college websites that I think will be really useful. So I'm going to come to you, Kelly, and see if there are any questions now.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, lots of questions. We hope that we posted more links, and we hope that people are beginning to access them now, those people that were having trouble. Holly's kindly put the link directly on our website page to make it easier for people to find and access. So if some of you are joining us late, we're really sorry that you've had difficulty getting in. We are recording this, so it will be made available on our YouTube channel. We'll make sure that link's made available to everyone too. So for questions, we do have some coming in now. We've had lots and lots of suggestions for future events, which is really helpful.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Yes. One question I've had is, could we advise on keeping records while using telehealth? So obviously a lot of people working remotely using telehealth and remote consultations. So is there any advice for those people?
Yeah, there's some good advice on the ICO website about recordings and how long you've got to keep those for. But generally what they say is that you follow the same principles of records. They are a patient's records. But there's also some good advice on lots of colleges' websites about how you store them, because obviously they take up a huge amount of megabytes on your computers. So they've got some really good information on different colleges about how you do that. I can't remember the actual specifics, but it's all up there.
Sorry, Kim, I think that might be me the way I asked it. I think my understanding of the question is whether you would need to do anything differently if you're having your consultation with your patient or client remotely. So if you're doing the telephone consultations with patients, and my understanding, I think, is really you keep the records exactly the same. The only thing you might add to that, and we probably should add to that, is the fact that the consultation was held in that remote way.
And you could also add, couldn't you, Kelly, about who was with the patient? So you know, information about that. This is a remote consultation. The patient was joined by their husband. I was actually joined by a student. You know, so that would be really important to set the scene for the consultation and how long it actually lasts. What, you know, simple things like what the action plan was at the end of the consultation. So what decisions did you make, and documenting those and agreeing those verbally with the patient, and following it up with some sort of follow-up record keeping with your patient once the consultation's finished, is following it up really with an email or a letter to your patient to actually sort of summarize the consultation. So there's, I think our webinar on remote consultation that's actually looked at that, so do have a look at that on YouTube. That covered lots and lots of that sort of information.
Brilliant, thank you. We will try and pop the link to that webinar in the chat box for people to access it. I think that was done back January time, wasn't it? Another question is, how much detail must you give regarding your clinical decision making, i.e. reference to underlying theory, etc.?
Well, it needs to be so that a person who's picking up your notes understands why you decided a specific treatment. Okay, so or a specific treatment option. So it may be the fact that the evidence shows that this particular treatment is better for this particular condition than others, and I wouldn't expect you to actually write the reference, because that would be, you know, some people can fantastically remember the references and the dates, but you can clearly say something like the evidence clearly says that this specific treatment is more relevant for this specific condition, and you would have to justify that if you were ever asked in a court of law, you know, where was the evidence, what evidence was that?
Great, thank you. Some other suggestions.
Sorry, Kelly, it's more about the decision-making process in your mind, really, and documenting that process. Things you weighed up, you discussed it with the patient, you looked at the risks and benefits of different types of treatment, and you discussed that with the patient, and you came to a joint decision that this would be the best way forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. There's another, I've just been scrolling down, and there's actually another question that's very similar. You know, how much detail for your clinical decision making? So I'm hoping that that's helped to answer that one too. A couple of questions unrelated to record keeping that we'll try and post a little answer to in the chat box, about becoming an FTP panel member, and someone asking about the audits and whether we treat independent practitioners differently. The answer is your answer to that is no, we don't, but I can pop a little bit more information in the chat boxes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the ICO, when they said that they look at record keeping in a pragmatic way, I think is a really good, for me, that was really helpful to know that they were recognising the difficulties of record keeping during the pandemic, and they were taking a sensible and pragmatic approach, which I thought was really, really useful. Brilliant.
Yeah,
That's some
thank
great
you very
questions
much.
there.
Thank
brilliant
you.
questions. Lovely. So let's move on to our next slide with some other resources. I wanted to signpost you to a few things that we found really helpful at the HCPC for engaging with you, both as employers and employees. But this is one thing that's specific for employers. So those of you on the call who are employers, we had a employer newsletter last month, which was about well-being, health and well-being, very topical at the moment, really, really important. And our next one coming out in July is on equality, diversity, inclusion. So another really, really important topic. So and I know that Kelly and Holly will be putting the link for you to sign up to this employer newsletter. We know that you already sign up to In Focus with us. Well, not you sign up, you get In Focus. And this is some more material really for employers that specifically link to being an employer of registrants, so that we thought that might be quite useful to remind everybody to sign up to that again. And I'm shamelessly promoting the Student Hub. We've had a lot of students going and accessing this hub, and I know if there's any students on the call that you have been finding it really useful. We've included a lot of these webinars on there. There's a lot of animations, there's a lot of case studies. There's some quizzes on there that are really useful for you. And there's also some blogs and top tips as well. So I know that you use the HCPC standards during your essays and your assignments, but actually it's got also some really useful stuff as well. And if you'd like to produce any materials for the hub, then do get in touch, because our communications team would absolutely love to hear from you. So those are two things I wanted to talk about today. So what have we covered? We've covered quite a bit on standards of record keeping, covered two things really: keeping records, accurate records, and the importance of that, and the importance and the reasons for that, and how relevant that is for you as registrants. But also the big thing that we get most queries about is about keeping records securely, and also the legal issues that we often get questions from. So we've covered quite a few of those, but again, if there's any concerns about those, then do pop them in chat, or if you've got any other worries, because those are the two big areas that we've looked at. And I wondered, Kelly, if you could share with us, or share with me, because I haven't had time to look at the chat, what are the topics people have asked for in future webinars?
Yes, so we have had some requests for returning to practice information, quite a few actually asking for that stuff, and we're fortunate to have Grace online, who's been doing quite a lot of work around return to practice, and so as long as we can get her internet in good order, we could I'm sure do something around that. We had a biomedical science student asking about a webinar concerning new registrants, what they should expect, guidance, tips, etc. I don't know if you have visited our student hub, but there is quite a lot of information in there, and Kim and I are, or particularly Kim, is working very closely with some education providers at the moment to start to create more content and learning materials for students. So that should be coming soon. What else do we have? Future sessions, confidentiality, data protection using Teams and Zoom, not only from the perspective of the software, but more importantly from the perspective of other people in people's homes. That one, again, we'll post the link to the event that Kim ran in January, I think it was, that's around remote consultations, and we explore all of that in there. So if we post that link, it's available on YouTube and you can have a look at it. So quite a lot of ideas coming through. Thank you everyone else for their thoughts, and we'll take those away. But I'm hoping that some of the events that we'll post a couple of links that hopefully will help people find some of this stuff.
Yeah, they're really interesting topics. I'd certainly love to do those. And I know Grace would absolutely adore to do one on
returning to practice. Yes.
And I know how important and how passionate she feels, and certainly I feel that people who return to practice, and I was one of those people who returned to practice, need support and need guidance. And also for me, I needed a reminder of the code of conduct for the NMC, and I needed to read that again. So actually that's a really important point. So thank you ever so much for that. Brilliant. I think we've got
Sorry,
our hands
I've just
full
seen Holly
next
has
year.
just posted. Holly's just posted the link, so you should be able to see the link now in the bottom of the chat box to the remote consultations webinar.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks, Kelly. That's fantastic. Okay, so a bit of Slido for the last bits before we wind up. So I'm going to ask you my usual questions, my 4 usual questions. So again, they are really helpful for us. And now we've got a full set of 10 lots of your answers. So that's been really helpful. So after this session, how do you rate your understanding of record keeping? I do appreciate that people have got concerns about the remote nature of record keeping and those sort of issues. So I hope that's a little bit more helpful to you. But that looks really good on the screen as I can see it. And I know that on my phone, I can see even more votes coming in. So that's actually really reassuring. But record keeping has been an ideal one to do as a last session because it really underpins, as I said, everything that you do as registrants. And also it's so important to keep a record of everything you do for patients, mainly for continuity of care, really, so that you can see what's going on. And I know that you learn loads about it during your undergraduate education. So my next question is, now when you think of the HCP, what word comes to mind? It's useful for us to see if it's any different or the same. That's always quite nice. And I think most of the answers we're getting are things like regulatory standards, which is quite useful as well. Supportive, expensive is up there again. But we've got supportive coming through quite a bit, and I'm hoping that's what we are hoping to be. We want to be supportive for you as registrants, and to make sure that you recognise that we do have a lot of stuff that's helpful to you and helpful and underpins everything you do. So that's really important to Kelly and myself and Holly and Grace. So thank you very much for that. That's fantastic. Thank you for all those words. That great. Thank you. And another last couple of questions is, how likely are you to recommend this training to your colleagues? We do ask you to, we will, as a reminder, send you out an email after this session with a survey in it. And once you've done the survey, you can then download a certificate. And having been to the Cpd workshop yesterday, that certificate and your reflections on this webinar could be one of your CPD activities that you include if you're chosen for an audit for your at the end of the year for when you do your registration, because we do that. So, and my last question is, has this session helped you reflect on your practice? Yes or no? A very quick one. We do ask you in your survey about different areas for this. This is really helpful as well. So thank you. That's a very quick one. Everybody's voted extremely quickly. So thank you very much for that one. And my last one is, has your knowledge of the HCPC improved? Yes, no, or it was already good. That's my last question. So thank you for that. And I hope that everybody managed to join who wanted to join. And I know Grace will be really disappointed about not being able to be part of our conversations today, because she's done an awful lot of work to prepare for this session. So okay, so this was the last of our webinars, the last of our 10 webinars, as I said to you before. We will hopefully be repeating these later on in the year. We'll be updating them and repeating them, but they are all available on YouTube and they are all recorded, which is really helpful. I wanted to signpost you to a couple of events that we have on our calendar, but it sounds like we've got some really good ideas of some other events that are going to go on our calendar. The one that I talked a little bit about earlier was the virtual CPD workshop. As I said, I went to that yesterday. There is one in June that's really helpful. You can put in your diaries and sign up for it now. There are also virtual employer events that are signposted there for you for September time, which are quite useful as well. I'm sure there'll be some in the meantime for those. As per usual, there are our contacts. If you want to speak to Kelly or myself, email the professional liaison service. If you want to speak to Grace and Matt, email the policy service. And you've obviously got a direct line to Holly when she writes your emails to invite you to these sort of events. And as usual, I wanted to finish with 3 thank yous, really. A thank you to you as registrants for keeping us all safe during this pandemic. A thank you to you for joining these webinars and for all the hard work that you put in every day, and your commitment really to health and social care. But thank you for joining us for all these wonderful events. And I wanted to finally thank my colleagues, because I know in person Grace and Matt and how much they spend as a policy team, A, answering your queries as registrants, but B, also preparing for these webinars and making sure that that, you know, these case studies and the answers that we provide are relevant and up to date and current and underpinned by our guidance. And Kelly, my boss, who spends a lot of time with me to try and make sure that these events meet your needs as well, and listens to me wittering on about them. And also Holly, who's really a mainstay really of making this happen. She's the making this happen person, because without Holly, these whole series of webinars would never ever be made. So thank you particularly to Holly for all that really hard work. So we have loved spending time with you, and I'm sure we will spend much more time in the future with you. But thank you for joining our webinar. It will end now, which is a great shame. So I've enjoyed the last 10 sessions, and I hope you have too.